Hey guys, Louie here with Self-Inflicted Recovery, Redemption, and Life. If you've been with me for a while, you already know a little bit about me. My addiction ramped up when I was 16 to 17 years old. I used pretty hard for about 17 years. Lots of different things, but mostly cocaine, weed, and alcohol. I've been clean now for about 4 years. As I got sober, I realized that my addiction caused a lot of pain and misery in my life, and also caused pain and misery for those who cared about me. This podcast is an effort to share some of the things that I've learned and realized over the last several years, with the hope of helping people who are considering starting the journey, or helping those who have already started down the path to stay on the path. Or maybe help some of the normies out there to understand how the world looks from our perspective. If this is helpful, or you can relate, please take a moment to share this with others. If you're listening on iTunes, please take a moment to scroll to the ratings and review section, provide me a rating, and write a review if you're so inclined, if I'm worthy of it. Doing these things will help this get out to more people. Right. So, what I'm about to share deals with several of the things that I'm free of now. I actually wrote this several months ago, and the night that I wrote this, I was in a meeting. And there were some folks in that meeting who seemed to be reminiscing and even romanticizing their addiction and their use in that meeting. And it made me reflect on some of the things that I've gained, some of the things that have improved in my life, and some of the things that were negative that I'm now free of, things that were terrible that I've now left behind. When I look at my life and how it's changed over the last 4 years, and I compare the before to the after, it makes me realize what a monumental level of effort went into maintaining my life as a habitual weedhead and alcoholic. It was exhausting, and I no longer have to worry about those things. If you don't listen to this whole thing, I would say listen to the last 10 minutes or so. That's when the shit gets really deep and really real. So I'm pretty sure this is a relatable statement for those of you out there like me. My addiction controlled my life, and I had to do lots of different things to accommodate it, and it was exhausting. In retrospect, it was so much extra work to live fucked up all the time. I would describe that behavior as obsessive, as crazy, even as irrational. One example that comes to mind is that whenever I would go on a job interview, since my normal state was to always be in an altered state, when I went into an interview, I would have to get high beforehand. Because if the hiring managers and leadership at that company met me high, and I always showed up high, which is how I was going to show up, they would think that that's just how I was. If I showed up to the interview clear-eyed, then when I showed up to day one high, they would know something's up. They would think, this dude is different than the dude we interviewed and hired. So the trick was to smoke just enough so I could act normal, since being sober wasn't normal for me, so that I could be in my normal operating zone of highness, enough to relieve my anxiety, but not so high that they obviously knew I was high. I had to skirt that line. And it was very nerve-wracking to have to smoke in the car before the interview, and then worry about my breath smelling like weed or like alcohol, or worry about putting on too much cologne, or worrying that my fingers smell like weed, or whatever. It was all just a monumental pain in the ass, generated a lot of extra anxiety that I didn't need, and I'm free of it now. I also no longer have to carry Visine, cologne, gum, and those things were necessary so that I could manage the visual and olfactory elements that come along with being a weedhead. Another thing that used to stress me out that I don't have to worry about anymore is back when I was doing a lot of coke. I used to have a kit in my pockets every morning. I'd have to keep either napkins or tissues in my pocket. I'd also put nasal moisturizing spray in the pocket along with my bullet and some Coke vials. The napkins were there in case I got a nosebleed. The moisturizing spray was there so that I could spray myself in the nose a couple times a day to stay moisturized, in an effort to hopefully avoid those nosebleeds. Also at that time I used to run the streets, sell a lot of dope, and just be a general all-around scumbag. And when that happened, violence would happen from time to time. When I was in my coke phase, I used to worry about getting punched in the nose, specifically. Now, you're probably saying to yourself, geez, Louie, getting punched in the face is never a good thing. But physical violence and getting in fights was a normal thing for me back then. And I would agree, getting punched in the nose is always a bad thing. But when you're coked up and your nose is completely dried out, there's a potential there for real damage. I used to envision taking a punch to the nose and my nose just exploding with blood and gore and viscera. And that is one more thing that I no longer have to worry about. Another example of my addiction encroaching on my freedom, I had to be afraid of drug tests. First of all, I had to do research on companies, either on the web or from other people who worked there or had worked there, to figure out if I needed to be prepared for a drug test. And this was before the advent of artificial urine. So back in the day, you had two options. There was the herbal bullshit cleansing drink, and that never worked for hardcore smokers like me. Or you could smuggle in a bottle of your homeboy's piss who didn't smoke. So I had a buddy of mine. He used to do drugs back in the day, but he stopped in our late teens, early 20s, and he was my go-to for when I needed clean piss. I would call him up. He would come over and drink a bunch of water and then piss in a bottle. It would be like the travel type container that goes in luggage. And a lot of work would go into this scheme before I even got him to pee in the bottle. Let me walk you through it a little earlier in the time frame here. First of all, I had to find the right bottle. One that didn't make a lot of noise opening, because a lot of the time someone would be standing outside the bathroom listening for weird sounds. The bottle also had to be large enough to contain a large enough sample of not Louie's piss. Preferably it was a squeeze type bottle. And it would also have to be the right size and shape to fit between my legs. And I would have to wear 2 pairs of underwear. I would wear tidy whities on the outside and boxer briefs that I would normally wear. And I actually had a single dedicated pair of tidy whities that would sit in my underwear drawer for years, only to be used in the event of trying to get a new job. Then I'd have to duct tape a full bottle of urine to the inside crotch of the tidy whities, and then I'd have to don this special attire over my boxers, maybe an hour before the piss test, and I'd have to walk around in the parking lot to bring the urine up to body temperature. And it was a ton of prep work. There was a ton of mental anxiety associated with it, thought and preparation, and it made me feel ashamed. It made me feel like a totally broken individual, because when I was going through that whole process, it really made me realize how controlled I was by my addiction. It made me feel like a crackhead. You know, it would obviously be easier just to not do this anymore and not have to go through all this extra work, but I was incapable of that, and this made me realize it. So, because I used to have to go through this, whenever I would nail an interview and then know that I was going to get the call and get a drug test, it would really freak me out and cause me a lot of stress, and that's ridiculous. The interview process and presentations and panel interviews and all the other hoops of fire and bullshit that you go through to get a job, that is supposed to be the hard part. For me, it was the other way around. I would absolutely murder the social aspect, and then sometimes things would fall to pieces over a drug test. Another gigantic pain in the ass that I'm now free of. I'm free of having to ask my buddy for a disgusting favor, and I'm free of feeling that guilt and shame. Another thing a lot of you guys can probably relate to is this. Scheming to make sure that you have all your ducks in a row to get and stay as messed up as you want. You know, having all the stars aligned. Here's a good example. I took my wife to a Sublime concert once. I think it was for her birthday, and there were a ton of people at this concert, and this was in the height of my addiction. So we came to the concert with pre-rolled joints and blunts, but we were not allowed to bring in alcohol. So we're jamming out, having a good time, getting high, and I'd been drinking at home and in the car. Awesome idea, not risky at all. I say that jokingly. Anyway, I'd been drinking in the car in an effort to get drunk enough to enjoy myself, because that was a precursor to enjoying myself. I had to be drunk. And then when we got to the concert, I had to maintain my drunkenness. And let me remind you, this was all in the name of having a good time. So I went to the bar, and there were 5 or 6 different cashiers and 5 or 6 different lines. And there were throngs of people swarming the bar area. And I sit in line for 30 minutes the first time. I get there to the cashier, and I tell them I want 2 shots, large ones. I want a beer for me, and I order my wife some kind of fruity wine cooler thing. And I don't remember if we were married or not at this point. But they told me there was a limit. Since she wasn't in line with me, I could only walk away with 2 drinks. So this is the internal reasoning process that my addicted brain goes through. Shit. I can't get enough alcohol waiting 30 minutes between trips to the bar to get and stay drunk enough. I can't drink fast enough to outpace my metabolism. Even if I drink these drinks and get right back in line and wait 30 minutes, it won't be enough to stay drunk. So I say, all right, cool. I can't leave with more than 2 drinks, right? And the cashier's like, right. I'm like, okay, can I buy 4 shots now, slam those here at the register, and then walk away with my beer and my fruity drink? The girl at the register said that was fine. That's what I did. The people in line behind me, everyone around me saw me slamming the shots, and they thought it was hilarious. Little did they know it was really because I have no control over my addiction. Similar thing when drinking at a bar on a busy night. I'm trying to scheme to get into the shortest line in order to maintain my drunkenness, to outpace my metabolism. My point is this. Because I was worried about managing and maintaining my drunkenness, it took away from my enjoyment of spending time with my girlfriend and my wife, and it took away from the enjoyment of me watching the show. Instead, I was worried about scheming ways to work the system to maintain my drunkenness. Another example of going to extreme lengths to manage my addiction, we have some rivers not too far from town, and it's a popular thing to go in the summer and float the river on tubes. Trips down the river can take maybe 3 to 7 hours depending on where you went. And of course, I'd have to bring a cooler full of booze, and I'd have to rebottle my whiskey or tequila into something plastic because glass wasn't allowed. And it would go into a cooler strapped to another tube, and then we'd spend a couple of hours the night before rolling joints and blunts. And then we would have like a Tupperware container and put them all in a plastic bag in the container, or a special waterproof case that went around your neck on a string. And the whole day was a chore to stay drunk enough, but not so drunk that you would fumble the joints and blunts and get them wet or drop them in the water. And it was a major party foul to light one up and then someone dropped it in the water. That is yet another thing I no longer have to worry about. Other things like making sure I have a pipe or papers, or being on the beach and not being able to light the bowl because of the wind, not being able to have my parents or kids in my truck because it smells like weed. Or one time we were camping, and this was after we'd already dropped acid. We forgot the papers and the pipes and the bong. And we literally spent like 2 or 3 hours walking through the park asking random people if they had papers. Luckily, we didn't get arrested or anything. It's just insanity looking back at this stuff, you know? Another way I had to plan for my addiction, to accommodate my addiction, was how I structured my work. And for the last 3 to 5 years of my addiction, my memory was so bad that I couldn't remember anything. I mean, I couldn't remember a damn thing. Let me put this in perspective. So I'd make a phone call, and it was a common thing for me to forget who the hell I was calling while the phone was ringing. So if I was calling someone, I literally had to have their name up on the screen so that I wouldn't forget who I was calling, between the time that I dialed the last number, the phone rang, and they answered the phone. So talking on the phone is a big part of my job. I'm in sales, and remembering who you're calling and what you talked about and what your action items are and what their action items are and your agreed go forward steps after the meeting. Those are all very important things. What I started having to do to accommodate my addiction and my memory loss was I started to have to take notes on every call. Basically, so I'm having a conversation and I would take word for word notes on the conversation. Specifically who said what my action items were, what the action items were of the other participants, what we agreed to as far as the go forward steps. This was all because if I didn't take notes, I wouldn't remember what we talked about or what we agreed to do moving forward. I'd also have to prepare a to-do list every day before leaving for lunch. And this was for when I got back from lunch. Because if I didn't, I would go out at lunch and get high and start drinking. And if I didn't have a list of things I needed to do in the second half of the day, I would just do a bunch of bullshit that wasn't really important. What I mean is, every day, you have a handful of really important objectives you need to accomplish. Everything else is all good and well, but those top 3 or 4 objectives are what is really important to your success. Everything else is just gravy. So if I didn't prepare my list before coming to lunch, I would go off into the mental pasture and do a bunch of unimportant things instead of doing the super important critical tasks, right? Here's a couple of other more serious things I no longer have to worry about. This first one is something that you've heard me talk about before, but it's worth mentioning. I think I talk about it in my story. But in the first home we bought, I would usually smoke weed in the garage when I could. But if it was too cold in the winter or too hot, here in Texas and get 110 degrees outside in the summer, probably 130 in the garage in the summer, I'd have to smoke in the master bath. So to accommodate this, I actually had a second vent fan installed before we moved in, so that I could turn on both vent fans and I could smoke, and it would suck up the smoke so as not to contaminate the rest of the house with the smell. I also had a paper towel roll, or toilet paper roll, wrapped with a dryer sheet, rubber banded around the end, and I blow smoke through that to manage the smell. And the reason I'm illustrating all this is just to show you what kind of steps I had to go through to accommodate being able to smoke as much weed as I was accustomed to. Then I'd have to go home straight from work, or I would come home straight from work. I'd say hello to my wife and children, I'd give them all hugs and kisses, and then I'd immediately go to the bathroom and start getting high. The last couple of years before I got clean, my kids ranged from 3 to 4 years old, 5 to 6 years old at the very end. Naturally, I get home and they'd be excited to see their dad at the end of the day. But I would go and lock myself in the bathroom to get high, because these children, who were amazing gifts from God, they weren't enough to inspire happiness and joy in me. I had to get super high before spending time with them. So I would be locked in there in the bathroom, and they'd be sticking their little fingers over the door, or they'd find toys that would fit under the door, and they were making an effort to coax me to come out and spend time with them. And my life was passing me by. These are special parts of my life that I'll never get back. Instead of spending time with my children, I was hiding in a bathroom getting high. And that would break my heart. I remind myself of this on a regular basis. I wouldn't say regular, but a semi-regular basis. It used to bring tears to my eyes to reflect on that experience. So now, I'm free of that. It's a wonderful thing, and I'm free of the pain and the shame of that. I still have regret over it, but I've changed that so I'm not guilty and shameful anymore. Another example of how my addiction had me going out of my way to manage it was this. I used to smoke weed every morning before getting in the car to commute, and then I'd get in the car and continue smoking weed. Typically a pipe or a joint, sometimes a blunt. And when I say a blunt, I'm not talking about what the youngsters call a blunt today, which is a cigarillo. I'm talking an honest to God, perfecto, a real deal blunt. Anyway, when you smoke weed in the car, you get used to the idea that since your car smells like weed, if you get pulled over, you're going to jail. Do not pass go. Do not collect $200. Go straight to jail. So here's how I mitigated that risk. And again, here's how I accommodated my addiction. I would type up an email and save it in my drafts folder on my work laptop. And I would leave a note card for my wife. And there was a contingency plan in place. And this is the Louie gets arrested note card. Break glass and follow steps if Louie gets arrested on the way to work. And on the note card, provided a link to Outlook Web Access. OWA allows you to log into a corporate email address from a different computer. For example, a home laptop or a home desktop that is not your corporate laptop, because the corporate laptop would have been with me in the car. And on that note card were instructions to change the date, my boss's name, to pull up the template email, and send that email to my boss. And that email said something to the effect of, "Hey, this is Louie. I'm sick. I've got an appointment scheduled tomorrow morning with my doctor. I should be back to work tomorrow or the next day." And the idea was that way, when the police pulled me over, and I know I'm going to go to jail for maybe 12 hours, I could text my wife before I get arrested and ask her to bust out the emergency note card and send the email. And the reason this was necessary was, it takes a lot to get fired if you do your job well. But one of the things that will get you fired is the no-call, no-show. Just falling off the radar and not reaching out to anyone. But, if my boss got an email, I'm in the clear. And this would buy me the 10 to 12 hours that I needed to get out of jail and get back to work. So, speaking of getting pulled over, that's another thing that I'm free of and don't have to worry about anymore. I used to just absolutely have a meltdown mentally in terms of anxiety whenever I got pulled over in the past. That's because I knew I was extremely high, and there was a good likelihood I had weed in the car, and there was a really good likelihood that I would go to jail because I was usually in possession of marijuana. In fact, about a year into my sobriety, I remember getting pulled over for the first time, and the cop straight up said, after, he asked me for my license and my insurance, he said, "You seem really nervous." And I'm like, I was just honest with him. I told him, "Yeah, man, I used to be drunk and high pretty much constantly and have weed in my car all the time. But I've been clean and sober for a year. But even though I'm clean and sober now, old habits die hard. So I get pulled over by you guys and I get really nervous." And, he was cool about it. He was like, "All right, cool. Well, I'm glad you're sober." He gave me a warning and I was on my way. But still, I was just straight up with him, and it was funny realizing that. This is yet another thing I no longer have to worry about. The last thing that I'll share with you guys that I am free of is this. For the last 3 to 4 years of my use, I would drink until I would black out. Pretty much every single night. I'd usually end up blacking out somewhere between 11 p.m. and 1 a.m. And I would usually lay down to go to bed between 1 and 2. So there were usually 2 or 3 hours at night after I'd blacked out before I went to bed where I'd be walking around doing things. And the next morning I wouldn't have any memory of doing these things. I'd wake up and maybe the dishes were done or the house was clean or whatever video game I'd been playing would have been saved an hour or two after my last memory or whatever. The point is, I knew I was up and doing things, but I had no memory of it the next day. Now, when you go to sleep drunk, your brain doesn't go into a REM state until you're sober. REM stands for rapid eye movement, which is deep sleep, and it's when you actually rest. So, people with sleep apnea, they don't go into REM sleep. So that's why they can lay in bed for 8 hours and then wake up exhausted. So, when you go to sleep drunk, it's kind of the same thing. You aren't actually resting. You're not getting to the REM state, right? Until you get sober. So I'd go to sleep drunk, and I'd sleep for 4 or 5 hours, sometimes less. And then I'd wake up, and I'd start smoking weed at like 6 a.m., and I'd drive to work. And while I was driving to work, I'd continue to smoke weed. And back then, I would drive through neighborhoods to avoid traffic. And every morning, I'd see people riding bikes or jogging. Sometimes I'd see kids walking to the bus stop. And I'd be so exhausted, I would micro-sleep. And micro-sleep is where you fall asleep for a fraction of a second. It's basically like an abrupt change between consciousness and unconsciousness. And a lot of times it happens when you blink. And what always terrified me was I was going to fall asleep on the road, and I was going to run over one of these joggers or one of these bikers, or a kid or a dog or whatever. And I mean, if I killed myself, that'd be horrible, but at least I did it to myself. I made the choice to take the risk, and I deserved that outcome, as tragic as it would be to leave my wife and kids behind. People who were just walking or jogging or whatever, they didn't sign up for it, right? They didn't sign up for that risk. I did, but they didn't. And it would have been truly tragic if I had injured someone else or took someone else's life. I would have gone to jail. It would have been a bad, bad situation. So, these are not my finest moments as a human being. I'm grateful that I achieved sobriety, and I feel strong and secure in my sobriety. The thing is, that addictive voice never goes away. And it's important for me to remember these types of lows, these types of painful and negative things that I'm free of. And it's important for me to hold them close to my heart. And I'm not saying I should be ashamed of my past behavior. I don't have a reason to be ashamed if I've changed today. It is okay for me to be regretful. But it's also important to remember the emotional and sometimes physical pain that was associated with my behavior in the past. And remember what that shame felt like. Because I feel like that'll help me to stay on the path. I think the reason it's important to remember these things and hold them close to your heart, and I think I mentioned this in previous episodes, is because as time goes on, we tend to forget the pain and tend to remember the good times. And if all you remember are the good times about your addiction, when that addictive voice tries to tell me that maybe I'm normal and talk me into maybe seeing if I can use like a normal person, I might be too weak to resist. On the other hand, if I recall these negative experiences and the pain and disappointment that I've experienced in the past, and I hold that kind of thing close to my heart, and I remember it often, when the addictive voice pops up, I'll see it for exactly what it is. I'll feel the revulsion associated with going back to the way things used to be. The loneliness, the hopelessness, the sadness, the disappointment, the obsessiveness, the extra monumental effort and extra anxiety that I used to go through to accommodate my sobriety. And that's the kind of thing that will galvanize my resolve to stay sober. So when the addictive voice starts talking to me, I'm disgusted by it. I recoil from it as though it were a hot flame, because I refuse to lose touch with the pain that my addiction has caused me. That being said, it was helpful for me to write down my lows from pre-sobriety and be detailed about the emotions that those lows evoked. And as I get more sober time, I write about the wonderful things I've gained, and I'm detailed about how that feels also. It keeps me grounded, because that way I know what awaits me if I go back. I know what I give up if I go back. So, what types of things are you free of now? What types of things await you if you decide to get sober? What types of things await you if you choose to go back to using? Send me your thoughts. I'd like to hear from you. Send me an email at selfinflictedrrl@gmail.com. Send me an email with thoughts on the episode, things you'd like me to reflect on, possibly discuss, questions, feedback, whatever you got. I'd love to hear from you. Again, if this was helpful and relatable, please take a moment and share it with others. If you're listening to this through iTunes, please take a moment and scroll to the ratings and review section. Provide me a rating and write a review if you're so inclined. Doing these things will help me reach more people with this. That's all I had for you this evening. Thanks, everybody. Louie out.